Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is Phil Harris, and hope everyone's having a great week. It's pretty crazy, but we're here on February 1st, 2024, for those of you that feel like January has flown by. So thanks for joining, and we're excited to have Kip Working talk to us today. Before we jump into his presentation and learn a little bit more about him, just a brief announcement from the IP section. For those that may not have yet registered, please, if you're interested, register for the IP Summit, which will be held February 16th. We have both in-person and virtual options available, so if you haven't had a chance yet, please do register for that. If possible, this week would be great. We would love to have some final numbers so we can make sure that we have everything lined up. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Sarah or Scott, or you can reach out to the bar as well. With that, I'll kind of briefly introduce Kip Working, who's going to be speaking to us today. We're excited to have Kip, and as you can see from the slides, which are hopefully coming through for everybody, he's going to be talking to us about patent valuation, especially. Kip has been practicing for quite a while and has lots of different experience, especially in the patent prosecution arena. He's worked with a few different boutiques and firms and assisted in a lot of different technology areas, so he brings a nice broad view on things. Kip is also an expert in various patent office procedures, and like I mentioned, is going to be digging in on valuation pieces in addition to some of his experience in the prosecution arena. So we're excited to hear from Kip and all his experience, especially on valuation and the examples and everything. And Kip, we'll turn it over to you. And we will kind of, if you have questions as we go along, you can put them in the chat, but Kip will open it up, I think, at the end. But Kip, feel free to let everybody know, and we'll please take it away.
Thanks, Phil. I appreciate that. As you mentioned, my name is Kip. I'll be speaking about patent valuation today. The title of my talk is Return to Assertion Value. And as I go through the slides, you'll see basically trying to address a phenomenon whereby a very small fraction of patents tend to drive the value of a portfolio of patents. And I'd like to describe the phenomenon and then suggest ways to address it if it needs to be addressed. So I'll just go with my next slide here. I'll start. This is kind of like a headline quote to get us thinking. This is from Professor Wasserman. I think she was at Stanford. And the quote is, "Many believe the root cause of the patent system dysfunction is that the PTO is issuing too many invalid patents that unnecessarily drain consumer welfare, stunt productive research, and unreasonably extract rents from innovators." And what I think is interesting about this is that I think this is exactly wrong. I think that the PTO is suffering, or the patent system is suffering from a plague of valid patents that are valid but nevertheless unenforceable or problematic for other reasons other than their validity. And that's a phenomenon I want to talk about and try to address. Before I go further, I want to give thanks to some colleagues. Mike Bone and Jim Bonack at VLP Law Group, where I currently work, are colleagues and mentors who have been tremendously helpful to me, and I have an eternal debt of gratitude to them. Same with Brian Hanks and Jonathan Lee at Greenberg Traurig. They were my previous colleagues and mentors, and I feel the same way toward them. And I wouldn't be here giving this presentation without the help that they've given to me in my career, so thank you. So I want to start with an analogy. An average news agency sells 55% of all magazines received. 45% of what is sent to the business fails to sell or is either returned for resale or is dumped. So it's about a 45% fail rate. I was kind of amazed the first time I heard that. You go to a magazine rack like at Barnes & Noble, half of those magazines roughly are not even going to be sold. So it's kind of wasteful industry. Here's another example. 55% of the papers published between 1981 and 1985 in journals received no citations at all in the 5 years after they were published. This is another example of a wasteful industry. The people writing these journal articles are doing a lot of work. They really believe in what they're doing. Later on, in many of these cases, half of them, nobody's citing to them and nobody seems to really care. Here's a wasteful industry. In the United States, food waste is estimated at between 30 to 40% of the food supply. So on one sense, that sounds negative because we like to avoid waste. On the other hand, if it's a necessary evil, that might be the best we could do. You know, if we have to have 30 to 40% food waste in order to have a food supply, then we'll take that. And so I want to ask whether the patent system is like that, and if there are ways to reduce the level of waste that we see. So here's another quote. It's anonymous from a partner at a prominent technology firm talking about a phenomenon whereby patents are being sold to clients, and in many cases, the inventors or the CEOs, they don't fully understand that that patent might not be fully enforceable in court. The person told me in confidence, sometimes you feel like a used car salesman. And I think ethically, we would all like to avoid that. So to consider, though, this phenomenon, the heavy skew in patent valuation, here's some quotes, and I'll start with academics. This is from Professor Wagner at the University of Pennsylvania. It says, the vast majority of US patents pass their lives in complete idleness, gathering dust rather than revenues. And here is another quote from the academics. This is Mark Lemley, one of those preeminent, patent lawyers of our time, and he works as a practitioner at the federal circuit level, and is also a chaired professor at Stanford Law School. I'll read this whole quote because I think it's worth reading in full. Why in the world am I optimistic about the patent system? The answer has to do with the case of the missing patents. There are over 160,000 new patents issued every year. Where do they go? Well, some of them get litigated, but despite the dramatic increase in the numbers of litigation, we're talking there about maybe 1,000 to 2,000 lawsuits a year. We're talking about maybe 1% of all actual patents ever being litigated. So the focus of the patent law system, which has been on patent litigation, is actually directed to only a tiny subset of those patents. There are other patents that get licensed in negotiated transactions, but never go to litigation, of course. That increases the number beyond 1%, but at most it raises the number to 2 or 3%. We're still talking about only a tiny percentage of all patents. So that's a very heavy skew, and what it creates is what I would call the 1% patent, which is that patent in a portfolio of, say, 100 that is very, very valuable. It's driving the value of that portfolio. It could be $1 million or a $10 million patent. And that 1% number is so small, the question arises, can we make that number higher? Now, rather than academics, you could listen to high-profile patent brokers. Here's one from GTT. This person told me, 1% of the patents in a portfolio drives the value of the entire portfolio. And here's another. Louis Carbonneau, who spoke at the IP Summit last year, is a very high-profile broker, used to work at Microsoft, and recently put out on his newsletter, first, the so-called bad patents are gone. Nowadays, there are so many ways to invalidate an issued patent that no one in their right mind would want to enforce their rights with anything but the highest pedigree assets where indisputable validity, strong infringement theory, and substantial damages must be assumed. The flip side to this, only a minuscule percent, way less than 1%, can meet this very high bar, and the smallest blunder in drafting or during prosecution can be fatal, leaving absolutely no margin for error. Oh, I think I quoted that twice. And then here's a quote, not from brokers, but from litigation financing. This is Adam Gill, works at one of the premier litigation financing firms in the patent litigation space. 98% was the number he told me of the percent of offers from patent owners for litigation financing that his firm turns down. So imagine you're a CEO at a company, you have your blood, sweat, and tears, you work in your garage, you have this great new product, you build up your business, you get a patent on it, someone infringes your patent, or so you believe, you go to Adam Gill, you say, hey, I cannot afford a $4 million trial. If it goes to trial, can I get some litigation financing? Because I think I have a strong case here. 98% of the time, Adam says, no, I have to turn you down. I don't think you can actually enforce this patent in court. And then this is not quite the 1% number, but still a very strongly high number, a shockingly high number. This is from Judge Moore. I don't think she was at the, she was a professor, I think, at this time, now Chief Judge. 53.7% of all patentees allow their patents to expire for failure to pay maintenance fees. So that's kind of an amazing number. And her article, Worthless Patents, goes into how high that number is and why it is. And one reason you might want to consider this is if we're down to just 1% of the patents having this kind of value effect, the concern would be raised that are we going down or are we getting close to zero? It's a question for our profession. We don't want this number to be going even lower than it already is. But the good news, the silver lining is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. If the 1% number is 1%, then to double the value of your portfolio, you would only need to change that number to 2%. Or to triple the value of your portfolio, you could change it to 3%. That's not a lot of work. You know, in 100 patents, instead of having one blockbuster patent, you could have two. So you don't have to do major surgery to try to get pretty sizable financial returns if you're trying to improve the value of your patent portfolios. So what we're really talking about are superlinear returns, the difference between a normal distribution and a superlinear distribution. And the example I think about is, imagine a very tall NBA player walks into a party. That's part of a normal distribution in terms of the height. The average height in that party is still going to be relatively the same. Whereas if Bill Gates walks into that same party, the average net worth goes through the roof. It's a different type of curve. And that's how patents are valued. It's kind of a weird aspect of how they're valued that's important to appreciate when you're trying to decide how to draft and how to secure them to make valuable patents and valuable portfolios for your clients. So what we're talking about here, I think, is an iceberg phenomenon, similar to what Professor Lemley was talking about, where 99% of the patents are not really being inspected or litigated or enforced most of the time. You could say it's 99% or 97% or 95%, but it's the vast majority. They're kind of like the iceberg below the water. Then you have litigated patents or licensed patents, maybe 1, 2, 3% of them. Those are between the red and the blue line here. And even above that, which I find very interesting, there are patents that never get litigated, but are worth hundreds of millions and millions of dollars worth of licensing transactions. Those are kind of the best patents to have at all. So explanations for this phenomenon. Why does this happen where you have this huge skew where only 1 or 2 or 3% of the patents are driving the value? These are all important reasons. And if you're a litigator and you're focused on fighting patents over and over again, which is, you might not realize just how important or how profound or pervasive some of these other phenomena are. So one explanation is that patents are very brittle. The law has made patents too difficult to enforce along some dimensions, or at least some would say that. This is documented in Professor Hussik's article, Will Patenting Make as Much Sense in a New Regime of Weakened Patent Rights and Shorter Product Life Cycles? Where he explains, since about eBay in 2006, the Supreme Court and Congress have done things that have really beaten up on the strength and the value of patents. If you look at Supreme Court decisions, something like 80% of the decisions or 75% of the decisions are going against patent owners and resulting in weaker or less enforceable patent rights. Same thing with the AIA in 2011 and the creation of the PTAB. That made patents less valuable. A very big event was the Alice decision in 2014. On top of that, we have what Professor Lemley calls the fractioning of patent law. Historically, 100 or 150 years ago, the analysis of whether a patent was valid was more analogous to copyright. It was more holistic. And since then, over the last 100, 150 years, the ways to invalidate a patent has multiplied. And you have all of these tests now. You have utility, patentable subject matter, enablement, written description, indefiniteness, obviousness, anticipation, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to succeed on all of those. And because there's so many ways to invalidate a patent, it's made them more brittle. Another phenomenon is that it's impossible to predict product development and detailed infringement analysis in advance. So when you might be trying to enforce your patent might be 10 years after you actually secure the patent, but there's a natural inherent difficulty in predicting what the product infringement analysis is going to look like. There's not really much we can do about that. Measurement is expensive or impossible. There are PhD economists who have explained that sometimes when you itemize and try to evaluate patents and list a numerical value for them, they'll put a question mark because it's so hard to know how valuable they are. One of the most important phenomenon, and you'll realize this, is if you're a pure prosecutor who does a high volume of work like I do, many patents are used for non-enforcement reasons. There can be used for signaling reasons, and there can be perfectly rational reasons and that make financial sense to secure a patent without ever really intending to go into court to enforce it. The blockbuster article about this is called Patent Signals by Professor Long at Columbia University. As another example, Professor Jonas Anderson at the University of Utah, right by here, he has an article called Non-Excludable Surgical Method Patents, where Congress has created a statute that allows you to get a patent on a method of conducting surgery. And then they have another statute that says if you get that patent, it can't be enforced in court. And yet they still get these patents. There are thousands of these patents, and the surgeons get them and they hang them up on their wall. And then there's a last phenomenon. This is the one where I think we might have some room for improvement. The key decisions made during patent prosecution are often made, I would argue, by individuals in a context that misaligns with the ultimate goal of patent enforcement. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So returning to patents are brittle. I've been getting into real estate investing on the side, and I joked to one of my friends who is also a partner doing patent law. I said, you know, maybe one of the reasons why real estate can be a good investment option is you can still get an injunction in real estate. That is not nearly as true in patents as it used to be. In real estate, it's common if you have a squatter in your yard, like here, and you call the sheriff, you say, hey, this is my yard, he's squatting, please kick the trespasser out. The sheriff comes and expels the trespasser. In patents, it's not really like that since the eBay decision, and that's another reason why patents are much weaker and harder to enforce than they used to be. So I mentioned earlier all of the different things you have to have a successful patent enforcement action, and at a high level perspective, you would need infringement, validity, and those are not the only two things. Sometimes people think that they are, but in addition to that, I would also add these ones: detection. So even if you have infringement of a valid patent, if you cannot detect infringement, then it might as well not be infringed at all. And then lastly, you have to have sizable infringement. In other words, the amount of economic activity that is being infringed has to be so big that it's worth the cost of enforcement, because enforcement's very expensive. So you have to have all of those. And so you'd have to have a bullseye right here in the middle. And according to the stats I was showing you earlier, many patents fail at least one of these. And so they don't hit the bullseye in the middle, and so the patent's not really enforceable. And some of them don't hit any of them. There's actually a surprising number of patents that don't hit any of these four categories, even though you're supposed to get in the bullseye. So if you drill down even deeper, I mentioned Professor Lemley, I mentioned all the ways to defeat a patent action. He was really focusing on validity, but you can also add these other ones that I was talking about, including infringement. And basically, you have to score almost a perfect 100 on this in order to succeed with your action. You could do direct infringement or indirect infringement, so you can choose between those two. But basically, other than that, you kind of have to win on every single one of these issues, more or less. And that's just a very, very high standard. It makes it very difficult to successfully prosecute a patent, and that's why so many of them fail to satisfy the standard. Now, one thing you'll hear about in this context of how hard it is to enforce patents is that, well, we don't need a very big breadth of our claim because we're just using patents for defensive purposes. And one thing I think is important to point out in that context is a patent can be used defensively, but it's still like a sword. It's not like a shield. So a patent is not like someone's coming at you with a lawsuit, you raise up your shield and it blocks you. It's more like someone comes at you with a sword, you have your own sword, and because you have your own sword, you're defensively warding that person off. Another way to think about it is patents are like mutually assured destruction. They're not like an iron dome that's going to block off someone else's patent and protect you. It's you have your patents, they have their patents, and you have to actually threaten to take out or attack the other person, and vice versa through mutually assured destruction, or else the patent doesn't have its deterrent effect. It doesn't have its defensive effect that you're looking for. I think that's important to keep in mind when you're considering whether to relax your standards on infringement simply because you are adopting a defensive posture. One of the things I mentioned earlier for the reasons why you have this phenomenon are non-assertion uses of patents. So we mentioned signaling value, which Professor Long talked about. We mentioned credentialing value, such as the surgeons who get those patents and put them on in a frame in their office. Those are all valuable reasons, that financially rational reasons to get a patent, but enforcement value or assertion value, as the valuation experts would say, dominates those other values. So you might spend $30,000 to get a patent on a surgical patent and put it in your office to impress your clients. But a good patent, a blockbuster patent in, for example, the pharmaceutical space, or a good technology patent on maybe a standards essential patent might be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And there are certain verdicts coming down with big eye-popping numbers like that. And you would never see those kinds of numbers for some of these other kinds of value. So I think it's, even though we seem to have drifted away from enforcement value, and that's why the 1% number is so low, it's important to keep it in your mind, because that's really where most of the financial value can come from, or where most of the financial opportunity is. Another factor I mentioned for this heavy skew in patent valuation is that measuring the value of the patent is very expensive or even impossible in certain circumstances. And so there's the story of, you know, the guy has dropped his keys, he keeps looking for them, but he can't find them under the lamppost. And I said, well, why do you keep looking there? And he says, well, that's where the light is. Similarly, there are certain things you can measure cheaply and quickly, such as whether a document has typos, whether it was turned in on time, whether the inventor, who is not an expert in patent valuation, is happy with what you drafted, whether there are nice, big, beautiful drawings associated with it, or whether you've indicated you did a lot of hard work, you wrote 100 pages of specification, you've done a lot of work for the inventor. All of those things are noisy correlations, have noisy correlations with patent enforcement value, because they're cheaper and quicker and faster to measure, but they don't necessarily give you what you really want, is the answer to the question, can I go into court and enforce this patent against somebody? That's the enforcement value, and it's hard to actually capture that. It's not the person's fault that they might be focusing on the other things, because there's really not much light over here. That said, I think you can get carried away, you know, or some of the metrics we do look at can be very misleading. This is a popular ranking of patent law firms called the top patent firms, and it's measuring how many patents you get, a particular firm gets in a year. And so when I first discovered this, I thought it was very strange. The firm that would be getting, you know, 5,000 patents is considered more a better firm or a more top firm than another firm that might be getting, you know, 4,000 patents. And I thought, you know, you can easily manipulate that number. That number is not really capturing what you want. You want not just having a patent to have a patent. You want to have a patent that has enforcement value. So if you wanted to manipulate those rankings, or just to show how misleading they could be, here's a formula for conquering it. You could write a set of 100 claims with 99 claims, depending from claim 1. You could write claim 1 to be 3 pages long. You could file a patent application directed just to claim 1, then file a continuation application directed just to claim 2 with a terminal disclaimer, and then repeat steps 4 for the remaining claims 3 through 100. So if Richardson got, you know, 5,000 patents, then you could use that formula and get 100 patents for each one of those and get 5 million patents, and then you'd be the top patent firm. But it'd be very misleading, because those patents would not be adding meaningfully to the, you know, to what you really want, which is financial value. Here's another metric that can be misleading. This is a quality score tool from an online tool, Patent Bots, that's going in and measuring 3 separate measures and then ranking what the quality is accordingly. So you have a 99.9% score, 99.7% score. And what is not being measured here are all of these things. So the three metrics being measured by Patent Bots are antecedent basis, and that's not necessarily going to tell you, it's probably the most helpful of the things it's checking for, but some antecedent basis errors don't arise through violations of Section 112. It's checking claim dependency errors, which that's only really going to affect dependent claims, and most enforcement actions are based on independent claims. And it's checking for written description support. And again, that wouldn't really affect original claims because those claims are generally self-supporting and self-enabling. So this is my point is that this is a very noisy indicator. It doesn't necessarily tell you how enforceable a patent is. It's not checking for all of these other things that you would need to know to decide whether it is the patent is enforceable or not. And so it's very, very noisy at best. And because it's very noisy, it can be misleading. It's the same with this. I've spoken with Jeff O'Neill at Patent Bots about the tool that it's using, trying to point out some of the limitations of the tool. And he said, Kip, I agree with you. It's limited and it's a noisy signal. And we're not trying to suggest that our tool is indicating how financially valuable the patent is. We're really trying to provide a measurement of craftsmanship. You can go in, and if they have these basic errors on the left, then that would suggest that the attorney is not using a lot of care and a lot of attention in crafting the patent. And so I understand, I appreciate that response from him, and that makes sense. And I still think it's a valuable tool, and I use it and recommend others to use it. But on the other hand, I want to emphasize that, you can do something with craftsmanship that ends up building something at the end of the day that financially doesn't make sense. So you can imagine digging a hole in your yard and then filling it up and back again. And at the end of the day, you have something that is not financially valuable. You've dug a hole and put it back in, and you can do that with a lot of craftsmanship. You use a great shovel, you could do it on time, you could do it on low budget. And same thing with the patent. You could have a patent that is 100 pages long with beautiful drawings, 0 typos, and that patent could have 0 enforcement value for any one of a number of different reasons. And that's really what we want to focus on. And if we don't focus on that, then that is helping to create this heavy skew where only 1% or 2% of the patents are really driving the value of these portfolios. So the last phenomenon I talked about is, let me check my time real quick. The key decisions made during patent prosecution are often made by individuals in a context that misaligns with the ultimate goal of patent enforcement. So what is this context? Well, the first thing I'd mention about this context is prosecutors are generally paid the same regardless of whether the patent is enforceable or not. That's kind of the way it has to be for institutional reasons. I don't see a way to change that, but it is remarkable. It'd be analogous, I would say, if you go and buy a car and you spend, $30,000 on a car, you could spend $30,000 on a patent, but then you don't check whether or not the car actually drives. And either way, you still get $30,000. And then most of the time, you actually never check whether the car drives or not. You wait maybe 15 years, then you finally check to see if it drives or not. And then most of the time, it doesn't drive. That's the situation with patents. And it's kind of a weird and remarkable situation where you're getting such a high fail rate in terms of being able to actually go into court and enforce your patents. Another part of this structural problem or misalignment I'm talking about is the big time gap. The time you're getting the patent is generally 15, 20, or 10 years before the patent would ever be stress tested. Most patents are never stress tested, but even when they are, there can be a big lag between them. The other, another phenomenon is the eternal temptation, which I'll talk about in a subsequent slide, which is during examination, you're working with the examiner who's only examining on validity. And because there's only a test on validity, you're constantly tempted to compromise on infringement in order to satisfy the examiner to get a valid patent. But by doing that, you compromise the overall enforcement of the patent because infringement ends up being lost. And then the last thing I'll say is, to repeat, the individuals making decisions during prosecution often lack expertise in patent enforcement as distinct from patent procurement. So who makes the decisions during patent prosecution? You have, from the company, inventors, CEOs, and shareholders, in-house counsel, and then at the PTO, you have examiners, and then on the flip side of examiners, you have registered practitioners. So every one of these individuals, I would say, is situated in a situation that creates structural incentives for them to compromise the enforcement of their patent, or it makes the value of their input limited when your ultimate goal is to try to enforce your patent at the end of the day. So from the company, you have inventors. They have limited input on anticipation or obviousness, or enablement, or correct inventorship. The law of obviousness is very different than colloquial obviousness, and most inventors don't understand this. Same thing with inventorship, can be very subtle. And all of these other things they have limited input on. On the other hand, inventors and engineers and programmers at companies, at tech companies today, have massive influence. And so even though they're not necessarily expert on patent valuation or evaluating patent documents, they make a lot of decisions that guide which inventions are being patented and how those patent applications are being prosecuted. So one thing you'll see is, for example, you send out a draft to an inventor, the inventor comes back and will correct reference numerals or notice that this particular reference numeral is not matching this reference numeral, and that's a valid error that should be corrected. However, those kinds of errors tend to have very little effect or no effect on the enforcement value of the patent. And so the inventor is just not trained in a way to understand what is going to make the patent invalid, enforceable or not. Now, the same thing with CEOs and shareholders. Usually these people are so abstracted away from the day-to-day business of patents, they don't really understand how, in many cases, they don't understand how vulnerable these patents can be to either invalidity or infringement problems. In-house counsel can come in kind of two different flavors. In one flavor, you have in-house counsel that, especially at a smaller company, might suffer from the same limitations that the CEOs and the shareholders I mentioned, experience, whereby they don't fully appreciate necessarily how brittle some of these patents are. Or on the other hand, you can have very sophisticated in-house counsel, sometimes at bigger companies, that have maybe worked, at a patent boutique or doing patent litigation and understand kind of the phenomenon I'm talking about. And in that case, even in that scenario, you're going to run into an issue where these people tend to be very, very busy. So at a typical big company that's in the top 10 or top 25 filers, the USPTO, you might have 5 in-house counsel at the top working with, say, 50 inventors on however many applications are down here, 200 or 500, whatever the number is. And what you'll see is that the in-house counsel is just outnumbered. There's way more inventors than in-house counsel, and then there's way more applications. And so, and these inventors only working on a small set of these applications, whereas each in-house counsel is responsible for a much larger portion of the applications. So what ends up happening is that most of the burden ends up falling on the inventors rather than the in-house counsel. So even when they have very sophisticated input to provide on the drafting process, they just have very limited time with which to spend doing that. One of the most important decision makers in the examination process is the examiner, but the examiner is only looking at validity. So only what I've circled here. The examiner is not providing feedback on any of these other things. And that creates a very jaundiced view of what makes a patent valuable. And that's almost the entirety of the conversation during the examination process. So when you're tying back and forth with the examiner and reporting these results back to your client, you're fighting over validity and making concessions often to try to secure a valid patent. But in doing that, in many ways, and many times, you'll end up sacrificing infringement. So there's problems with examiners. They have a jaundiced focus on validity, I mentioned. In many cases, they're undertrained. In many cases, they're overworked. They have very limited input on the factors that I've written an X on here. They provide the most feedback on anticipation and obviousness. And even in that case, their input is limited or can be flawed. So this would bring me to registered practitioners such as myself. And I would describe the rise of the pure prosecutor. Whereas before, you might have a prosecutor that was focusing on both validity and infringement, because that prosecutor might also be going into court and enforcing the patents. There are pure prosecutors today, such as myself, who just work with examiners getting patents over and over again. And so what ends up happening is that you're tested on validity over and over again, but your skills on infringement, there's a tendency, if you don't resist it, to have those skills atrophy. It's just because that's what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, year in and year out. And so you kind of train for the exam that you're being given over and over again. And this is interesting because by maxing out validity and compromising infringement, there's an asymmetry that works in the other direction, which is when you send a demand letter to an accused infringer, you can usually prove your product or service infringes this patent because you're only comparing two things, whatever the product or service is, and what the patent says. And you can say that your patent is valid and it's presumed valid, but nobody ever really knows for sure because there's trillions and trillions of references out there, and there's so many different ways to try to invalidate patent. So when you actually end up compromising the infringement of the patent, in order to secure validity, you're working again in the opposite direction of what you would want to because of this asymmetry in terms of infringement and validity. So this brings me back to the internal temptation. As a pure prosecutor, you're tempted. And so here's an analogy of a patent attorney in front of the garden of patents of good and evil. And you see your patent there, just if you'll just reach out and grab it. So that the temptation is to go out and get that patent by making an amendment to the examiner. And you can understand why this happens. The amendment makes the examiner happy. The examiner feels like he's a public servant. He's doing his duty as a goalie. He's making sure that only a valid patent is issued. The amendment makes the CEO happy because the CEO is happy to have a patent. The amendment makes the inventor happy because the inventor is happy to have a patent. The amendment makes you happy because you're happy to make your client happy. Everybody's happy. But the problem is the amendment also makes your client's competitor happy because the competitor no longer infringes. So with respect to the rise of the pure prosecutor, a pure prosecutor is kind of like an obstetrician. You help give birth to patents, and after that, you don't really interact with them that much anymore. And so later on, when you need to enforce the patent, that would be a different type of skill set. And so, but the analogy with a doctor would be, later on, if you get cancer or you would go see an oncologist, you wouldn't stay with an obstetrician. And so that's an analogy to help think about the challenges that prosecutors face prosecuting patents. So we've identified challenges with inventors and CEOs and in-house counsel and examiners when making decisions in the examination process. And so that leaves the registered practitioners, the pure practitioners, as I mentioned. And that means that the weight is on your shoulders, kind of like Atlas. You can't really rely on these other individuals to look over your shoulder and make sure that at the end of the day, the patent is going to be enforceable in court, or to be one of those 1% patents that provides the big financial value that your client is looking for. It's our ethical duty to do the best we can in this situation. So in a nutshell, for everything that I've been talking about, I would say the Patent Office gives you a presumption of validity. It does not give you a presumption of enforceability. And patent attorneys also understand presumption of validity. I mean, it's a term of art that we know, but it's so weak under the case law now that it almost doesn't exist. But even if it did, even if it was a strong, robust presumption of validity, it's still not a presumption of infringement or or a presumption of detection. And because of that, it's not a presumption of enforceability. And all of this is important, I think, because what you want to do is avoid leaving the inventor holding the bag. If you're dealing with a large, sophisticated corporation, this is less of a concern. They're going to have very sophisticated counsel. They're going to understand all of the phenomena I'm talking about here. But if you're talking about a smaller or a medium-sized company, they might, or if you're talking to the inventor directly, they might not fully understand just how brittle their patents are, or just how weak it might be if you try to assert the patent later in court. And so the duty, I think, falls on us as patent practitioners to make sure that the client is served well, despite these obstacles. So let me check my time. I've mentioned some problems, or at least some interesting phenomena to discuss, and I'd like to briefly go over some solutions or some ways to address them. The first thing I'd mention is I don't think there's a perfect solution. I think the way the system is built, for a variety of structural and institutional reasons, so to speak, it is the way it is, and you're not going to be able to do major surgery to change the way that it works. On the other hand, I think it's important to blow a whistle and to shine a flashlight on the kind of phenomenon I'm talking about. And I think if my presentation did nothing more than that would still be a worthwhile presentation. One of my former colleagues said, nobody can write a perfect claim. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement. And this, I think, also teaches tolerance, because the standard for creating a patent that is a 1% patent, that is an enforceable patent, which every client wants and in many cases expecting to get, is so high. It's, I think, important to be understanding and tolerant when evaluating patent prosecution work. So I'll quote, Judge Giles Rich here: the life of a patent solicitor has always been a hard one. And Louis Carbonneau, the patent broker I mentioned earlier, he describes a case on this podcast. You can see it at this link, where he was working at Microsoft, one of the most high-profile, biggest technology companies in the world, managing their patents. They had their family jewels patents that were the most important, and they thought the most valuable and the most enforceable. And that series of patents, 8 patents or whatever the number was, they all ended up being invalidated in court. And they were shocked. They were surprised. They were confident at the time that they were very valuable, and it turned out that they weren't. And so this, I think, teaches humility and tolerance and understanding, and understanding just how difficult the task is. Next thing you can do, and some of this is common sense, is to resist the temptation to soften assets. So going back to the icon I showed earlier, resisting that temptation to make the compromising amendment that's going to ruin the enforcement value of your patent, and instead hold the line and try to maintain a broad claim scope in securing a patent that has a chance of being a 1% patent. So here's an example of that. You can see for a patent that is very valuable, you can see in the behavior of the company and its counsel reflecting the fact that it's very valuable and that they actually expect it to be enforced. So I took this slide from Mike Pellegrino at Pellegrino and Associates. He explains on this particular patent, they had 9 non-final rejections, 12 final rejections, 9 RCEs, 6,000 days pending. And so there's a business reason that explains this behavior. They were fighting so hard because an essential ingredient this patent covers an essential ingredient in its Crest Pro Health toothpaste. And so that concept of fighting hard and maybe explaining to your client or getting them on board with the idea that it might be expensive to fight hard, I think is part of being a good patent prosecutor. But 9 RCs, that suggests you're making a lot of amendments. In addition to that, you could also consider just relying heavily on appeal. This is an article I published over a decade ago, the real rate of patent applicant success on appeal. I clocked it in at roughly 75%. And this is because I'm not just looking at PTAB decisions that are final, I'm also looking at how many appeal briefs did not go to the PTAB and how many pre-appeal brief requests were filed that were successful. When you factor in all those numbers together, the rate of success climbs all the way up to 75. And so that is another way to be persistent and stubborn and fight with the examiner without doing all of the RCEs and without all of the amendments associated with those RCEs to help preserve the chance of your patent being a 1% patent. Another thing you can do is you can fight illusions with illusions or counter illusions. So here's a common visual illusion. The square A is actually the same color as the square B, but on here it doesn't look like that due to the shadow. And one of the most famous illusions we know of is the hindsight illusion. Patent prosecutors are always fighting up against the hindsight illusion because examiners, just because of the way they're situated, struggle from it. Their brain naturally thinks of things from a hindsight perspective so that they seem obvious even if they weren't really obvious at the time. So one thing you can do is to fight an illusion with another illusion, which is the illusion of a longer claim scope tends to indicate a narrower breadth. So in a typical case, this is going to be exaggerated to make a point, but you can imagine you have a new product called unobtainium, like from Avatar. You have a method fueling a car with unobtainium and then driving the car to move the car. So this claim is so ridiculously short, it would never be allowed by the patent office in this example. But you can imagine in a typical case, what ends up happening in those 99% cases that the patent is not really enforceable. The examiner fights you, gives you a rejection, you add in a wearing clause that doesn't really do a whole lot for the enforcement of the case, but helps satisfy the examiner. So the car is a 1999 Jeep, the Jeep is blue, the driving is being performed according to a route calculated by a linear algebra equation, et cetera, et cetera. You add these features, they help satisfy the examiner, but they end up making the patent unenforceable. And this is an extreme example. You wouldn't actually do this in the PTO, but it highlights an extreme version of what actually does happen quite often. So rather than doing that, you can see that the examiner is allowing this because the claim is longer and presumably narrower. You could also make the claim longer, but without necessarily making it narrower. You could have it have the same or roughly the same claim scope. So what would you do? You could use repetition. You could use alternative language. This is what Big Pharma does in their pharmaceutical patent. There's a lot of Marcouche groups or a lot of alternative clauses with the signal or you could repeat recite or repeat inherent features. So in this case, you could say a method comprising fueling at least one car. So you've inserted at least one, even though that's redundant to A. You'd say car, vehicle, or automobile. Again, those are just alternative things of saying essentially the same thing with unobtainium. Driving the at least one car, vehicle, or automobile. So you're using repetition again to move the at least one car, vehicle, or automobile. That was fueled with unobtainium. So you're just repeating the first clause back in the second clause from a first location to a second location. That's an inherent feature. So you've added those words, but it's not really changing the claim scope that much if you think about it. So the cost-benefit analysis, this claim is a little less readable than the former claim, or maybe much more readable, much less readable. However, you've decreased your odds of rejection because the claim from a visual illusion perspective, seems longer, seems broader, and so you've decreased the odds of the examiner rejecting you. You've increased the odds of having a 1% patent or having some assertion value associated with this patent. Another thing you can do is do what infringers or policymakers are complaining about. So here is a blog article called "The PTO Has a Track 1 Filing Problem." And I pulled up this statistic today from the Patent Office. The average Track 1 pendency from petition grant to allowance is about 4 months. And that's amazing. Compared to a normal non-accelerated examination, that is a really high allowance rate at a very, very fast rate. And I can tell you just from my personal experience, it's not because there's a selection effect and these super blockbuster, amazing breakthrough cases are being filed with Track 1, and so you're getting very fast allowances. I think the PTO is actually giving you a better examination and a faster examination. And there's not, whereas without Track 1, you're getting a bad examination, a much longer examination with a lot more bad rejections. And so this is, this phenomenon whereby you're getting a good result with Track 1 was so strong that this practitioner, a very high profile PTAB practitioner, is actually complaining about it. The other thing that policymakers are often complaining about are creating patent thickets with terminal disclaimers, aggressive use of continuations and terminal disclaimers. So the United States is the only country with terminal disclaimers in the world in the patent system, as I understand it. And so to hear some of the complaints made, this is the amicus brief from Robert Armitage, who is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Eli Lilly in the past. I'm no longer with him, I think. And he writes in his amicus brief, notwithstanding the harassment potential from commonly owned and commonly expiring patent thickets, they are today entirely free from any double patenting consequences. Today, however, a single original non-provisional patent filing can spawn a virtual fortress of commonly owned continuation patents, typically with common expiration dates, such that a common ownership disclaimer imposes no real-world consequences. So, to me, that sounds nice. As a patent prosecutor trying to help patent owners, I would like to spawn a virtual fortress of commonly owned continuation patents. This phenomenon is also addressed by Director Vidal in a request for comments that she issued. You can see the link here. So some of the questions that were in this RFC were, how would eliminating terminal disclaimers, thus prohibiting patents that are obvious variations from each other, affect patent prosecution strategies and patent quality overall? Should the office require a common applicant or assignee to include all patentably indistinct claims in a single application, or to explain a good and sufficient reason for retaining patentably indistinct claims in 2 or more applications? Should there be heightened examination requirements for continuation patents to ensure that minor modifications do not receive second or subsequent patents? And can the USPTO implement a rule change that requires any continuation applications to be filed within a set time frame? So Director Vidal is putting terminal disclaimers and continuations in her crosshairs. She sees this as a policy. So when you see people complaining about Track 1 or people complaining about these continuation thickets, that to me is a signal that I would want to use these procedures for the benefit of patent owners before these rules or procedures are changed. So as part of addressing this phenomenon and strengthening your patent portfolio, you can use different methods to harden your assets, not just resist the temptation to soften them, but actually do things that actually strengthen them. And along these lines, I would suggest that you relax or even eliminate some previous assumptions that tend to come up. So one assumption is 1 patent per invention. So in many cases, if you have like 50 different inventions, like listed over here, you get 50 different patents on them. And I would say, let's consider relaxing that or abandoning that assumption. Same thing as less work is less financially valuable. So I mentioned the example earlier of the person who digs the hole and then fills it back in again. You're doing a lot of work, but are you creating financial value? Doing work and creating financial value are conceptually separate things. Another assumption is that you can't predict valuable patents. I will say, and I've talked to other practitioners that are more prominent and successful than I am, who've confirmed that they feel the same way, that when you're working on a valuable patent, you tend to know it. You tend to know it's an important patent. You either know 100% it's going to be one of those 1% patents, or you have a strong feeling that it has a good chance of being those. Same thing with a patent that is an enforceable junk patent that could never be enforced. When you're getting to a full first page claim, or on the second page of the claim, or the examiner just finding really good references, you start to get a gut feeling that this patent, even if it issues and you get your ribbon copy and send it to your client, is not going to be that value. And so I would question the assumption that you can't predict them in advance, and that because you can't predict them, you have to use a shotgun approach. And then the last assumption I would question or relax is that abandonment is failure. And sometimes by abandoning a case that is going to be a junk patent and taking those funds and recycling them or investing them in other areas, including other patents or redundant patents on enforceable claims, that might make more financial sense. So one of the things to do that is kind of common now is to file related patents on those patents that you think are more valuable or more likely to be 1% patents. So out of a portfolio of 50 patents, the company might pick these 5 and say, okay, we're going to do a PCT application. We're going to go in Europe and Japan and China. We're going to get some design patent protection. We might have some continuation or some sister applications. What I would suggest as a way to harden your assets is to consider doing more of this. So as I mentioned before, you can consider some of those junk patents, those ones that as you're working on it, you know is not a terribly valuable patent. It's never going to be enforced in court. The claim is too narrow, or whatever the problem may be. You could consider abandoning those cases, taking those funds and reinvesting them in one of your more promising patents. So here you see in this second one, you don't just have one sister US application, but now you've had a third or a fourth or a fifth, or you've added 100 extra claims to it. Those funds that were going to go on those wasted patents can build up the portfolio around your valuable patents and your valuable patent claims. And you do have a sense, at least I do when I'm working on these cases, of which cases are like that. They tend to be shorter, broader claims, maybe with a primary examiner who's giving you less friction on a blockbuster invention that as you think about it, this is a clever, cool invention. I've never seen anything like it before. You can build up redundant or semi-redundant patents around that, building up the thicket, which is what those policymakers were complaining about earlier. So you can compare the costs. People don't want to give up on a case that and abandon it. Abandonment emotionally sounds bad. You don't want to abandon something. So to avoid abandonment, you might spend $2,000 on a second RCE to file amendments, and those amendments might ruin the infringement value of the patent. So it becomes one of those 99% junk patents that can't be enforced. Instead, what you could do is, if you got over the emotional rejection of abandonment, allowed it to go abandoned, took that extra $2,000, just filed a new case, the cost of filing a continuation in one of your more valuable cases or more promising cases is about the same price. The cost of a new case is about $1,820, which is almost the exact same as your second RCE here. So you could have a second patent that's strengthening your portfolio around your more valuable asset rather than getting another patent on an invention in a case that's just not going to go anywhere. So with these kind of redundant patents I'm talking about, you get both. You get more signaling value because you're going to increase your patent counts, because when you get a second quote unquote redundant patent, it doesn't have to be exactly redundant. There could be some variation in the wording or the structure of the claim language, but basically the same overall invention with some variations, some minor variations in the wording of the claims. You don't have to rewrite the specification. So you've already saved $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 on drafting the case. Because you're saving that money, you can actually increase your patent counts higher than you would have if you got original cases on every single original invention. So you're strengthening your signaling value because you're strengthening the number of patents that you're getting, and you're also strengthening your assertion value because you're creating a lot of friction for your accused infringer to try to invalidate those patents in court. It becomes much more expensive to try to kill 5 patents or 10 patents in the PTAB than it would be if you just had 1 patent. So people talk about the disadvantages of the, check my time. Oh my God. Disadvantage of the PTAB. The one advantage is that you only get 1 patent per IPR. And the PTAB does not apply collateral estoppel. So what this means is that every redundant patent that you get is going to dramatically increase the cost and complexity associated with invalidating that patent in the PTAB. There are also sharp claim and page limits. So I've run some numbers here. You'll see that just the filing fees alone for each separate patent in the PTAB is almost $40,000, whereas the cost for getting a redundant patent, when you add them up, maybe $30,000. So already you're going to be spending less money getting this extra patent than they're going to spend killing it. And so that's another reason to consider this patent ticket continuation strategy that I'm recommending. There's a strategic examination. So one of the things you can do to harden your assets is you can add the statements to your notice of allowance explaining why the patent is actually valuable and allowable, not just what the examiner says. You can also add statements regarding secondary grant factors about commercial success, et cetera. These are all things that even if they can be defeated, become expensive to defeat when it goes into the PTAB or when it goes into district court to being challenged. You could add means plus function claims. Typically, most patents have 20 claims, 3 classes, and don't include means plus function claims. So if you're going to be adding extra claims, you could add an extra claim set of means plus function claims. You could add 100 extra claims, and all of that creates friction for your accused infringer. I'm going to skip ahead here. So another thing you can do is just close the gap. You know, I mentioned the problems with examiners and in-house counsel and pure prosecutors making some of these decisions. If you can get people involved who are experts in evaluating all of these factors, these ways to defeat a patent, then you can close the gap that I mentioned before. So these would be patent litigators, litigation finance experts, patent portfolio brokers and licensing experts, patent valuation experts. These individuals have to look at every single one of these to evaluate what is the overall assertion value of the patent. They work in teams typically, whereas a pure prosecutor typically works solo or mostly solo. So the analogy I would use is patents are so brittle that patent prosecution is like playing chess against Magnus Carlsen. If you're going to be playing against Magnus Carlsen, you want a team. You want people helping you, especially when you're looking at your claim language. So you can mention these individuals, the litigator, the litigation finance expert. You can bring them in and have them look at your valuable patents and that structure that I recommended before, building a thick continuation and related patent application thicket around your most valuable claims and your most valuable assets. You're closing that gap because rather than on the top, you'll see there's this big gap in time between when you're getting your case and when those valuation experts are coming in. There might be a 15, 20-year gap. You can close that gap by getting those individuals in and involved with decision-making earlier in the process throughout examination. 3 minutes. So to bring in litigators, how would you do this? Well, you would want to overcome some obstacles, some practical obstacles. One thing you could do is you can hire former litigators. Litigators, because they have to enforce they have to be experts not just at validity but also at infringement, and they've lived and breathed actually enforcing a patent in court. They are much less likely to make amendments than pure prosecutors are. So you can hire former litigators to do it. And now they're no longer litigating, so there wouldn't be a prosecution bar on them. Or if you have litigation counsel and you want to use them for litigation, you can have a second set of litigators, one that just helps you with your prosecution and another one that actually does your litigation. And another obstacle you might have is that it's very expensive to get these experts to come in and take a second look. So you can only review a fraction of the patent document. You could have them review claim 1 rather than reviewing the entire patent document, or have them review a fraction of the patents you're at, and then you can feedback that information. So the feedback you're getting on 1/10 of your cases can be applied going forward by your drafting team on the rest of your cases in the next year. So on the example, on the right here, you can see how you brought in the litigator, litigation finance expert, valuation expert, et cetera. They're looking at claim 1, which is the most important part of the document by far. Even though it's a very, very small part of the document, as you see on the left, it's very, very outsized in its importance. All right, last 2 minutes. These are 2 advanced techniques I'll mention briefly. One thing you can do to get better results and increase the number of 1% patents you're getting is to use omnibus applications. This is right there in the statute. If 2 or more independent and distinct inventions are claimed in one application, the director may require the application to be restricted to one invention. So Congress envisioned that you could put more than one invention in an application. And so you can use that to your benefit in an omnibus application. So typically, most cases have one invention in one patent. So you have invention 1, patent 1, gets examiner 1 on the right, invention 2, patent 2, and examiner 2 on the left, on the right. In an omnibus application, you take all 10 of those inventions, you put them in each patent. Each one of those might get a different examiner, but some of those examiners might be better or more competent or more busy or more expert than others. So this examiner 7 has a 99% allowance rate. This one over here has a 12% allowance rate. So if all of these inventions are in this patent application, you get this good examiner, you can go on later and prosecute those claims through that examiner. You could consider abandoning this case with the bad examiner or the unhelpful examiner. And then the last thing I'll mention is as an advanced technique, getting a new examiner. If you ever get stuck in an ER Commerce Art unit or stuck with an examiner who's not being helpful or is not expert at their in the art that they're supposed to be examining, you can file track one claim and delay the priority claim so that you'll get your first office action around month 1 or month 2, but then you can file your continuation claim later around, you have the limitation up to month 4. And when that happens, you're going to get assigned typically to a new examiner. The other way to do that is just skip the priority claim entirely. If there's no intervening art or you're not worried about the intervening art, you can get rid of that examiner. So these are 2 advanced techniques to consider. And then the last thing I'll mention is I've talked about different ways to strengthen or harden your assets. Another thing you can do is say, if I have this budget of $10 million, whatever it is, and I know many of these patents are not going to be enforceable, could I set aside a certain percentage of my budget to get patents that I don't intend to enforce? And then give my outside counsel that instruction so that they can minimize prosecution costs. And so you can make your claim very, very long, very, very detailed, but otherwise get the patent very quickly. Now you could get an unenforceable patent in 0 office actions rather than getting it in 1 to 4 office actions, and you could end up saving a lot of money. And you could still reserve, say, 20% of your budget or 50% of your budget towards patents that are really your family jewels that you really do want to go into court, that need to be really strong and robust so you can go enforce them in a court proceeding. And that's my presentation. This is my contact information. I'm available for further questions, resources, or coordination. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. I think I was right on time, so thank you so much.